This story took place about a year ago, and it unfortunately is about my 7-year-old son Brian. I live with my wife of 10 years and my son Brian in a house that we inherited from her parents. Before this, Brian never had any issues sleeping, ever. He's always been an amazing, well-mannered, and well-behaved kid. He always enjoyed bedtime. At the very mention of it, he'd go racing to the bathroom, ready for his annual bath every evening, and would wait for my wife to enter his room to read him a bedtime story. Every night, it never failed. But out of the blue, he became aggressive and agitated around bedtime. Then I knew something was wrong. As I mentioned before, he had always been a very well-behaved kid, so when he started lashing out and saying really hurtful things to my wife, it was a cause for concern and brought up many alarms in my head. In the first instance, my wife, as usual, told him to go get ready for bed and that she was going to run him his usual bath. I was just within earshot, sitting at our dining room table, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. Brian was across from me in the living room, watching TV. He didn't reply to her, even after she repeated herself, so I glanced up to see him with his arms folded and a scowl on his face. "I don't have to listen to you. You're not my mother," he said. It caught me off guard because though my wife is technically his stepmother, he never before had any issue with her coming into his life at all. I sat my phone down and reprimanded him, telling him firmly that he couldn't talk to her that way. He ran to his room crying, disappearing down the hall as I stepped over to my wife, who wasn't offended, just shocked at his response. We both walked down to his room, and though he was reluctant at first to talk with us, he apologized and admitted that he just didn't want to go to bed at that time. Again, as I said, he was pretty well behaved, so we were lenient, letting him stay up an extra 30 minutes before putting him to bed, which he agreed to without any complaints. The next few nights went on just fine, until a night I just so happened to be working late. My wife had tried putting him down for bed, running his bath as usual, but before she could get him in, he scratched her from her eyebrow down to her chin. She tried to get him into the bathtub before he went into a fit, thrashing and sloshing water everywhere, and in fear that he was going to slip and hurt himself, she tried picking him up. Then he scratched her, and oddly, the wound was rather deep. I was surprised he was capable of doing such a thing, not to say I didn't believe my wife. It's just that the wound was pretty serious. She'd called me crying over the phone as she explained the situation to me, that afterward he pushed himself into a corner of his room and screamed at her to get away from him. I had to leave work to drive down and make sure that they were okay. By the time I got there, Brian had slunk down into the corner crying, while my wife stood just a few feet away, trying to get him to come to her. After he cried and cried and cried, we were both able to get him to come over to us and explain what made him react so harshly. He told us he was afraid again to go to sleep, but wouldn't give us a particular reason, just that he was scared. So that night, we let him sleep in our bed, because we couldn't get a reason out of him after, still. He slept in our bed for a handful of weeks until I had to go out of town on a business trip. That night, since I knew I wasn't going to see my wife for a bit, after having dinner, I told Brian that he would have to at least try to sleep in his bed tonight. He seemed a bit annoyed at my request for him to sleep in his own room, but he did it without any buts. And the morning of that I had to leave, I kissed them both goodbye and was on my way. I was going to be out of town for 3 to 4 days because of my job, and of course, Brian was left alone with my wife. I didn't want to be as worried as I was, but I found myself calling every night, making sure nothing was out of the ordinary. She told me she hadn't had any issues with him, that he was sleeping soundly, and that she'd checked on him throughout the night, even offered he'd stay in the room with her. But he'd declined, saying that he'd be okay to sleep alone. It wasn't until the last day of my business trip that I got a call from my wife in hysterics, saying that Brian had been standing in the corner of his room for around an hour, and that she couldn't get him to come to her. No matter where she moved, his eyes remained locked behind her. When she would try to get close to him, he would scream. She seemed beside herself, and though I didn't think at all that she was lying to me, it was difficult to imagine, so I told her to video call me. I wish for the life of me I had screen recorded or something, because it was truly terrifying. I feel like it would have outlined exactly what was going on with my son, but of course, at the time, I didn't think to do it. The video started and I saw her face, and as she sniffled, she flipped the camera. I remember her again trying to coax him into coming to her. "Brian, your daddy's on the phone. Don't you want to speak to him?" she said. She flipped the camera and my son came into view. He was standing in a particularly dark corner of his room. He wasn't moving, just looking behind the camera as if he could see through it. I could tell that something was wrong. The way he was standing, the difference in his demeanor was just off. It didn't feel like my son. "Hey, buddy," I said, hearing my own voice feed back through the phone. "It's Daddy. Are you doing okay?" Nothing. He still just stood there. "Baby, are you sure you don't want to speak to your dad?" Silence. Still. Before my wife could get out whatever question she was going to ask next, Brian took a few quick steps towards my wife and screamed, "No." His voice wasn't his own. It was much deeper. I flinched in response and watched as the camera was thrown off kilter. I heard my wife scream and a thud followed by another crash. I couldn't see anything afterward, only listened as she screamed. I remained on the phone, a bit fearful and unaware of what really to do. I was worried about her, about Brian, because something wasn't right. I kept the call running, and from my work phone I called the church, one that my wife frequented. It was around 12 a.m., so of course no one picked up, but I left a message on the answering machine. I tried my best to comfort my wife and Brian as much as I could. I couldn't see anything after the crashes, but from the angle of the phone and the yells I could hear periodically from Brian, it sounded like she had ran out of his room. I could only see her shoulder, but I could make out the hallway from behind her. I would do my best to comfort her, and though I'm not religious, I prayed over my son. I could hear him crying softly through the door. I'd asked my wife if she felt safe enough to go into his room, and I heard her open his door. I could see from the way the phone lifted into her hand that she was moving. I didn't hear the strange voice anymore. It was my son, and he kept saying he was sorry over and over again. The camera stopped moving as I assumed my wife put the phone down, and I heard her console him. I told her to take him to her sister's and not to be in the house. I think for most listening to this that it becomes fairly obvious what was going on, and I refused to have my family around it anymore. As soon as everything had settled, I left for work early in the evening and drove through the night to get back home. In my days back home, I arranged for a priest to come over and bless the house, and afterward, we didn't have any more problems with Brian. I tell this story in hopes of helping some parent out there who may go through the same thing. Your kids, if they're afraid of something, regardless if you believe in it or not, it just may be exactly what they are seeing. This happened to be one of the scariest times of my life. My name is Claire, and my little sister's is Katie. Ever since I was 12, I shared a room with Katie, who's 5 years younger than me. I had just turned 16, and my parents had decided to give me my own room as one of my presents. To not leave Katie out, they redid our old room entirely so that it fit to her decor, and they did the same for me. I was super excited about having my own room, and some form of independence. Though I love my little sister, it was nice to have some privacy. Of course, I wandered off into her room from time to time, and she would come in and bother me just as much as little sisters do. But for the most part, we stuck to our own rooms, happy to have our own space. It wasn't until a couple of months later that I felt like something was off. For some reason, after a while, Katie didn't want to stay in her own room. She kept coming into my room a lot, not even bothering me at times, just coming to sit on my bed or curl up next to me. Don't get me wrong, we have a very comfortable relationship, but sometimes she would lay there for hours and hours on end, until I wanted to be alone again, and I would have to physically take her back to her room and put her in bed. My parents weren't home a lot, so I was responsible for dinner, and sometimes she would come into my room directly after school and sleep until her actual bedtime. It was always hard waking her up. She always seemed so tired. So I'd leave her be and feed her when she finally woke up. This went on for almost a week, and it was obvious that she either wasn't sleeping or was having a hard time at school. So I asked her that day when she got home if anything or anyone was bothering her at school. I told her that I was there for her and that she didn't have to be afraid to talk to me about anything she wanted. She had just come into my room and was sitting on the edge of my bed taking off her shoes. She looked over at me and kind of giggled. "No, nothing's wrong, Claire. I just don't like sleeping in my room anymore. The man keeps me up at night." My heart dropped into my stomach. "What man?" I asked her. "I don't know his name, Clary, but he likes to stand in my closet door," she said, blinking over at me. "And if I shut my eyes for too long, he moves closer to my bed. Sometimes he sits on it, or sometimes he stands." I was too stunned to speak as she paused, frowning before she continued. "It scares me a lot, but if I keep my eyes on him, he won't move." She'd said this so matter-of-factly it scared me even worse than it did before. And I tried to be subtle since she was opening up to me, doing my best to not scare her. At this point, she'd taken off her shoes and crawled up to sit beside me. "How long has this been happening, Katie?" I asked, and she looked away for a moment. It started happening a couple days after you left our room." "Well, why didn't you say anything to me or Mom or Dad?" I asked her. "Well, because I've been seeing him for a long time," she said, again in that same matter-of-fact tone. "What do you mean?" I said. "I would see him all the time. I saw him some nights in the room when we used to stay in the same room together, but it was almost like he was scared to come out because you were there. If you were in the room, he stayed in the closet. I don't think he likes adults." My head was now spinning because it all suddenly made sense. The reason she didn't want to go to sleep, and I had to think back. There were nights back in our shared room that I recalled if I wasn't in the room, Katie wouldn't sleep. She'd be up, sitting in her bed, either playing with toys or reading a book, like she was waiting for me. And as soon as I stepped foot into the room, it's like she immediately clocked out. I just initially assumed that it was because she was afraid to be alone. "I'm so sorry, Katie," I said. "If I had known, I would have never left the room." "It's okay, Clary," she said with a smile. "I know you wanted your own room so you could talk to boys," she giggled. I laughed sheepishly as she curled up into me, falling asleep. She was out instantly, and I sat awake with my head still spinning at the amount of information she just told me. I felt like I had to tell someone, but I didn't know who. My parents weren't ever really home, and I didn't feel like my friends would believe me. So while Katie was sleeping, I stepped out of my room and reluctantly called my mom. I couldn't think of anyone else to call, and we were rather close regardless. She chalked it up to her having an overreactive imagination, and that I shouldn't tell my father because he'd call it nonsense and become angry. I argued with her for a while, baffled that that was her first reaction. She ended the call abruptly, saying she had to get back to work, and to make sure that Katie was in her room when they got home. Pissed, I walked back to my room. Katie was still there. I cuddled up next to her and scrolled through my phone, trying to get my mind off of what she had just told me and the conversation I just had with my mother. In the weeks that followed, I let Katie sleep in my room every night. Because she was getting a lot of sleep, she perked back up and seemed to be more herself again. But since she was sleeping in my room so often, my mother became agitated with the whole ordeal, saying that she needed to sleep in her room, and that they didn't spend all that money on her room for her to be in mine all day. I remember the day like it was yesterday. We had just finished dinner, and my mother brought it up to Katie, scolding her out of nowhere and telling her that she needed to stay in her room tonight. Katie protested, telling her that she was afraid, to which my mom yelled at her, telling her that she was too old to believe in monsters. My father sat across from us quietly, spectating the whole argument, but said nothing. So I stood up for Katie, defending her. I told her and my father the truth, that Katie was seeing something in her room, and that it made her feel safe to sleep in my room. My mother and I went back and forth for a while, getting nowhere, and through all the bickering, she ordered Katie to go to her room, and despite her reluctance, she did. My father finally spoke up, raising his voice. saying that if she was truly afraid, she could simply move back into my room for as long as she liked, and that the conversation was over. My mother now turned to my father, angrily yelling at him, but I really wasn't paying much attention. I walked away, already irritated, down the hall to check on Katie, ignoring my mother's calls for me to come back. I rushed down the hall to Katie's room and pushed the door open, my eyes adjusting to the dimness as she sat on her bed in the dark, the only light in the room coming from her closet. "Are you okay?" I asked her. "No," she replied softly. I sat on her bed, pulling her in for a hug, and talked with her for a while, telling her what our dad had said and apologizing for our mother's words. We talked here and there for a little bit. I was sitting looking down at Katie as she scooted closer to me and hugged me. We sat like that for I'm not sure how long, before I heard a sharp inhale behind us. I glanced back to see our mother standing in the doorway, her hands frozen up along her chest, as she looked straight past me. I followed her eyes and saw a figure darting back into her closet, the lights still on inside. Whether Katie saw it or not, I don't know, but she didn't react if she did. Even though I hadn't seen clearly whatever it was no less terrifying. It was a full figure, completely black, but it made no noise. What was equally frightening was that you could see it clearer in the light. I stared at the closet opening for a while, and then slowly picked Katie up and ushered past my mother into my room. As I passed her, I heard her whisper something along the lines of, "I'm sorry," but I was too irritated to pay much attention to her. That was around 2 years ago, and I'm on the verge of moving out now. Katie will be getting my room, which I made sure to mention to my father, since he seemed to understand what was going on. I don't have the best relationship with my mother now, mostly because of her response that day. It felt so void of emotion to respond in such a way, especially when your daughter is expressing fear, whether it is something you may believe or not. Don't just think your kids have active imaginations. Sometimes they're seeing exactly what they describe. When I was 15, my parents split up, and that meant I had to bounce between my mom and dad's places with my little brother. When we visited our dad, he was busy working most nights, so we hardly got to hang out with him. That left me in charge of looking after my little brother. Taking care of him wasn't a big deal, but let's be real. No sibling likes playing babysitter all the time. During the day, our dad would take us to the park or out to eat, which was cool, but once he headed to work around 5 p.m., it became my responsibility to sort out dinner and put my brother to bed. Dad always made sure the fridge was stocked, so that wasn't much of a headache. However, sometimes my brother wasn't keen on heading to bed right away, like most kids. Our dad's place only had one extra bedroom for us, and we'd take turns using it each week. To avoid arguments, I often let my brother doze off on the couch with me, and he accepted most of the time because he didn't want to sleep by himself. On this particular night, I was chilling with my MP3 player, both earphones plugged in. My brother sat on the floor to my right, playing with his action figures. The TV show changed to something he couldn't watch. I can't remember what exactly. So I asked him if he wanted to see something else. He said no, so I turned the TV off, put my earphones back in, and enjoyed my music for another 10 minutes or so. I noticed my brother out of the corner of my eye getting up and energetically playing with his toys like most kids do. I was in the middle of switching songs when I caught him chatting away to himself. It seemed like he was having conversations with his toys, which was nothing new for him. I adjusted on the couch to get a better view of him while still enjoying my music. The way he was flailing around made me think he was going to fall and hurt himself. As I reached the end of my playlist and was about to switch to the next song, I heard him ask, "Do you like it here at Dad's?" I opened my mouth to answer when I heard a distinct male voice respond. It caught me off guard, and I can't recall exactly what it said, probably because the noise my brother was still making with his toys, and now the song that was now loudly playing through my earphones. What struck me was that there was no man in the room. It was just me and my brother. I knew all the doors were locked, the windows shut, and my dad's place was somewhat isolated. Even if it was someone outside, I wouldn't have heard it as clearly as I did. I yanked out my headphones and my brother looked up at me. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, getting up and checking outside just in case there was something or someone there. "My friend," he replied. "He follows me sometimes, but he doesn't like going to mommy's." Dealing with something like this isn't part of everyday life, and because I was uneasy, I didn't really know how to react. "Okay, cool," I said hurriedly, and told him it was bedtime. He complained that we hadn't eaten dinner yet, and I suggested he go into my dad's room while I made a pizza for us. He agreed and headed down to my dad's room. I never mentioned what had happened to my dad because, truthfully, I didn't know how to process it. Personally, I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, but my mom did, and she talked about it enough for me to know what was going on. I felt like whether I said something or not wouldn't have made a difference. Plus, it might have complicated things for my dad in terms of visitation rights, so I let it go. But still, you have to admit, that's some pretty creepy shit.